Okay, this is a podcast about the events leading up to the American Revolution. It's going to deal with the after the French and Indian War and up to the Intolerable Acts. All right, before we can talk about that, though, we have to talk about two theories. One is mercantilism, and the other is salutary neglect. Mercantilism was the economic philosophy of the time that said that colonies were there to strengthen the mother country. So colonies would provide things that the mother country needed to become more powerful. This is a political cartoon that shows what the colonies were supposed to provide to the mother country. So if you look at this political cartoon, we see the mother country sitting at the dinner table, and the colonies are providing her with three things that she's going to need to be more powerful. One, gold and silver, because wealth equals power. Two, foodstuffs, so agricultural products that might not be able to be grown in the mother country. And then three, raw materials that the mother country would need. All right, so the colonies were supposed to supply wealth, agricultural, and raw materials to the mother country. This is a map of the triangle trade that will kind of show you how that works. So if you look at the green arrows that are coming out of North America and the West Indies, the colonies of Britain at the time were supposed to provide things to Britain such as whale oil, lumbers, furs, rice, indigo, silk, tobacco, sugar, molasses, and as you can see, those things were all shipped from the colonies and into England. If you look at the yellow arrows coming out of England, you'll see that another part of mercantilism was that the colonies would also act as a new marketplace for the mother country, England, to sell her manufactured goods and her luxury items. And you can see that that is what is written in the yellow arrow coming out of London. Manufactured goods and luxuries, and these would be sold to the colonists. And that is another part of mercantilism, is that they also act, the colonies, as new markets for goods coming out of England. So in order to tie the colonies of North America to this mercantilist theories, the British Parliament passed a series of navigation laws or navigation acts around 1660. And what these acts did was say that certain products had to be carried on British ships and sold first in British markets before they could be brought to anywhere else in Europe. So this was to try and prevent the colonists from trading their goods with Europe directly. So instead, they would have to first be sold in British ports, and then the British would be able to sell them throughout Europe to make Britain more powerful. These goods that could only be sold first in British or had to be sold first in British ports were known as enumerated goods, such as tobacco and indigo. All right, even though the British had these strict navigation laws on the books, they were practiced up until 1763. The British government practiced something now known as salutary neglect. And what salutary neglect means is basically they had these strict navigation laws on the books, but they were not enforced strictly. All right, the British government was very lax in their enforcement of the navigation laws, and therefore one of the things that the colonists become to rely on is smuggling to get around these navigation laws and make better profits. All right, this is to show you here, King of the Smugglers was a nickname of John Hancock, and of course John Hancock is well known today for the size of his signature on the Declaration of Independence. But this is just an example that smuggling was not something that was looked down upon in the colonies during this time. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict that took place between 1756 and 1763. The British government is going to rack up a big debt during the 7 Years' War, and that is going to force them to try and look to the North American colonies as a new source of revenue. So they're going to begin to pass a series of acts that are greatly going to upset the colonists and help lead to the American Revolution. Now, on the North American continent, the 7 Years' War was known as the French and Indian War. If you take a look at this map, you'll see the British colonies on the east coast there in yellow. To the west of that, you'll see green striped land. The green striped land was area that was ceded to the British government by the French. Okay, so now after the French and Indian War, the British government is the dominant power in North America at the time. The French and Indian War was also important to the coming of the American Revolution because it was the first time that the colonists had to begin viewing themselves as united. This is a famous political cartoon that appeared during the French and Indian War. It was drawn by Benjamin Franklin, and it was trying to convince the colonists that they needed to unite and begin to see themselves as one. The British colonies had never seen themselves as one. They had viewed themselves as separate entities. So one of the things coming out of the French and Indian War, as Benjamin Franklin was trying to say right here, is that they needed to begin to think of themselves as one if they were going to survive as an entity. All right, and he drew this cartoon because he was trying to convince the colonies that they needed to unite against the French and the French's Indian allies. All right, after the French and Indian War in 1763, there was a series of Indian raids on west of the Appalachian Mountains. These are known as Pontiac's Raids or Pontiac's War. And if you look at this map in the Ohio River Valley, you can see the flames. The flames indicate places where the Indians attacked and took over British forts. So Pontiac's raids greatly feared the British government, or made the British government fearful of Indian raids, and it led to them passing something called the Proclamation of 1763. Proclamation of 1763 said that colonial settlement was off limits west of the Appalachian Mountains. If you look at that map, you'll see that red line goes right along the Appalachian Mountains, and the British government was here saying to the British colonies, you cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, this greatly upset the British colonists because the British colonists thought that they had fought this war for that land and had won this war, and that land should now be theirs to settle in. You know, one of the major themes in American history is this idea of westward settlement and westward movement. And that was true back in 1763 after the French and Indian War. The colonists had viewed this as their land now that they had won, and they should have the right to settle there. So the Proclamation of 1763 is pretty much ignored by the colonists, and they continue to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. All right, because of the Pontiac's raid, the British government also decides that they're going to need to keep a standing army in the colonies. And this is the first time that the British government had ever had a peacetime standing army in the colonies. It's something that the colonists view as something that they're not really comfortable with, all right? Because they think if Britain is now the dominant power on this continent and the French have ceded this land and the French are no longer a threat, then why now, of all times, is the British government going to keep a standing army in the colonies? So they begin to think that the army might be there for more than just to protect against Indian raids. It might be there to take away their liberties. And this fear is heightened by a series of acts that are going to be passed by the British Parliament, which we'll talk about now. And another thing about the standing army led to the British government needing to raise revenue in the colonies to help pay for the standing army. The view of Parliament was the standing army was there to protect the colonists, and therefore the colonists should help pay for it. All right, so after the French and Indian War, the British government is going to move away from salutary neglect. Remember, we said salutary neglect was the period where the British had these strict navigation laws on the books, but they were not strictly enforced. All right, so the British Parliament is going to try and limit the smuggling that is going on in the British colonies of North America. So they passed the Sugar Act of 1764 to try and prevent smuggling. One of the things this Sugar Act of 1764 does is it makes ships, colonial ships had to carry manifestation papers. Manifestation papers would say what cargo that ship was holding. It allowed the British government the authority to board these ships and check for manifestation papers, once again to try and put an end to smuggling. Another thing it did that greatly worried the colonists was it said that before the Sugar Act, if you were suspected of smuggling, you would be put on trial in front of a colonial jury where there would be a jury of your colonial peers. Now they were saying that you could be tried in a vice admiralty court. And a vice admiralty court would not be a jury by a trial of your peers. It would be a no jury, and it would be a judge that was chosen by the crown. So this loss of jury trial was something that greatly upset the colonists. Also, if you're going to have a standing army in the colonies, the British government was going to have to do something about housing these soldiers. So they passed the Quartering Act of 1765, which said that certain colonies were going to be responsible for putting these soldiers up and providing them with food and shelter. And we're going to see that this led to some problems in the colony of New York. Probably the act that caused the most problems in the colonies, though, was the Stamp Act of 1765. And that was because, unlike the Sugar Act, which only really hurt merchants and smugglers, the Stamp Act was something that was going to affect pretty much everybody in the colonies. And what the Stamp Act did was say that anything that was going to be done on paper, any kind of legal document or newspaper or magazine, was going to have to be done on paper that was stamped in London. And this was going to be the first direct tax on the colonists, all right? So before, the other taxes that the Parliament had put on the colonists were indirect taxes on imports and exports. This was going to be the first direct tax on the colonies. And this was something that the colonists did not agree with, and there was huge uproar to the Stamp Act in the colonies. Here you can see no Stamp Act teapots were made, and this other one with the skull and crossbones put the stamp here, that, you know, meaning that this is going to be the death of us, this tax on stamped paper. The House of Burgesses was the Virginia legislature. It was the first democratically elected legislature in the colonies. And the House of Burgesses is going to pass what is now known as the Virginia Resolves. And the Virginia Resolves, the House of Burgesses said that the Parliament of Britain did not have the right to directly tax the colonists. And their reason for it was something that is now known as no taxation without representation. So the Virginia House of Burgesses is arguing that the colonists are not represented in Parliament. And if they're not represented in Parliament, therefore the British Parliament has no right to tax them. So these Virginia Resolves are reprinted in newspapers up and down the colonies. So that's how Virginia reacted. Boston was going to respond in a much different manner. Boston responded with violence and intimidation. And if you look at this picture, you can see they're hanging a stamp collector in effigy right there, and people are throwing things at him. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see they also had fake funerals for these stamp collectors. You can see a casket there is being carried off. So Boston is responding with violence and intimidation. You can see another mob picture here. We'll actually be reading a primary source in class where they taught a first-hand account of a Boston mob that burns down a stamp collector's house. So this intimidation spreads throughout the colonies, and this note here, the first man that either distributes or makes use of stamp paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects. So intimidation becomes this tactic to get colonists to protest the Stamp Act and the coming of the Stamp Act. Here you can see Wilmington, North Carolina. In 1765, they forced William Houston, a stamp master, to resign through the use of intimidation. Another way that the British colonists in North America tried to attack the Stamp Act was a series of non-importation agreements where the colonies agreed not to import British goods. This is something they would also use later down the line with the Townshend Acts and then the Intolerable Acts. So non-importation meant they were not going to import goods or buy imported goods from British merchants. And this was something that greatly hurt British merchants and led British merchants to try and force Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act as well. So if they weren't going to be importing these clothes from Britain or some of these imported goods from Britain, they were going to need to make them their own. And this becomes something known as homespun virtue, this idea that is now a patriotic thing to wear homespun clothes instead of clothes that were made in Britain. The women who would make these clothes later became known as the Daughters of Liberty, who would produce these homespun products. The colonists also sent a representative to Parliament to air their grievances in front of Parliament. And that man, as you can see in this picture, is somebody that's probably recognizable to you as Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin is sent to air the colonist grievances in front of Parliament. Here you can see a picture of Benjamin Franklin in front of the Parliament. So the Parliament and we're going to be reading Benjamin Franklin's appeal to Parliament in class. Parliament agrees to repeal the Stamp Act, but they, on the same day that they repeal the Stamp Act, they pass something called the Declaratory